Elias set the end of the 10-foot spruce timber against the rough granite of the cave wall, his breath misting in the cool, salt-heavy air. The wood was damp, smelling of pine sap and the sea. He braced his shoulder against it, his boots slipping slightly on the slick rock floor, and began to lever it into place. Beside him, Boro, a great brown dog with the patient eyes of a seasoned fisherman, watched the timber's slow ascent. The dog's tail gave a single, solid thump against the stone. It was a gesture of quiet approval. Elias grunted, the muscles in his back and arms burning with a familiar fire. The timber slid into the notch he'd spent the morning carving, a clean, satisfying thud that echoed in the cavern's throat. 1 of 37. He wiped a hand across his forehead, leaving a smear of grime and sweat. His hands were a testament to the work, calloused, scraped, the knuckles raw. He had inherited them from his father, along with the small, leather-bound journal that now rested on a dry ledge near the cave entrance. The book was filled with his father's precise, angular script, detailing theories of wind shear, tidal surges, and the peculiar insulation properties of rock and earth. "The sea gives, but it also takes," one entry read. "A wise man builds not against the water, but with it. Find the strong places, the deep places." This cave was one of those places, a deep, high-ceilinged void carved into the sheer cliff face at the north end of the bay, its mouth sitting a full 20 feet above the high tide line. Most considered it useless, a dark maw that swallowed the morning light and echoed with the cries of gulls. To Elias, guided by his father's words, it was a foundation. It was shelter. "That's the craziest thing I've ever laid eyes on," a voice boomed from the shingle beach below. Elias didn't turn. He knew the voice. Mr. Gable, his closest neighbor, stood with his hands on his hips, his weathered face a mask of disbelief. Gable had fished these waters for 50 years. His knowledge of the coast was etched into the lines around his eyes. "What in God's name do you think you're doing, boy?" Gable called out, his voice carrying easily over the rhythmic crash of the waves. "Building a house in a hole? That cave will be a tomb when the first nor'easter hits. The sea will fill it to the rafters." Elias picked up his adze and began shaping the next notch. He didn't have the words to explain the complex fluid dynamics his father had sketched, the way the cave's angled entrance was designed to break the force of a direct wave, turning its power back on itself. He didn't know how to describe the series of smaller fissures deep within the rock that would act as pressure release valves, preventing the catastrophic compression of air that could blow a structure apart. His father had understood it. The journal explained it. Elias simply believed it. "It'll be safe," Elias said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the vastness of the space. Gable laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Safe? Boy, I've seen storms here that have tossed 100-ton boulders like pebbles. I've seen waves strip the soil from cliffs 50 feet high. You and that dog of yours will be washed out to sea like a pair of forgotten lobster traps." He shook his head, turning to walk away. "Don't say I didn't warn you." Boro whined softly, looking from the retreating figure of Gable back to Elias. Elias reached down and stroked the dog's broad head, his rough fingers sinking into the thick fur. "He doesn't see it," he murmured, "but we do." The work continued. Each day was a rhythm of labor. He felled the spruce and fir trees himself, high on the ridge behind the village, limbing them where they fell and dragging them down the steep incline with a block and tackle rigged to an old oak. Boro would trot alongside, a length of rope in his mouth, pulling with a seriousness that suggested he understood the importance of the task. They were a team of two, working from the first hint of dawn until the last ray of sun bled from the sky. He learned the language of the wood, the way a knot could turn a blade, the satisfying scent of fresh-cut pine, the heft and balance of a well-made beam. He learned the language of the stone, its cold permanence, the way it held the chill of the sea deep within it. He was building more than a shelter. He was building a conversation between the two. Anya found him there one afternoon, a week into the project. She didn't stand on the beach and shout like the others. She climbed the winding, treacherous path he'd cleared to the cave's mouth, a small basket in her hand. She was the town librarian's daughter, quiet and observant, with eyes that seemed to notice things others missed. "I brought you some bread," she said, her voice soft. "And cheese. My mother was worried you weren't eating." Elias stopped his work, surprised. Most people kept their distance, whispering among themselves about the cave boy who had lost his mind after his father's passing. He nodded his thanks, taking the basket. His hands were so dirty he was hesitant to touch the clean white cloth covering the food. Anya didn't seem to notice. Her gaze was on the framework taking shape inside the cave. The heavy floor joists were laid, and the first of the wall posts were being set. It was skeletal, a ghost of a cabin rising from the stone. "It's bigger than it looks from the village," she said. "It has to be strong," Elias replied. She ran a hand along one of the massive timbers he had just wrestled into place. "Mr. Gable says the water will come in." "He's wrong." She looked at him, a genuine curiosity in her expression. It was a look he hadn't seen from anyone else. There was no pity, no mockery. "How do you know?" For the first time, he felt a need to explain, if only a little. He walked to the ledge and picked up his father's journal, opening it to a page with a detailed cross-section of the cliff face. He pointed to the lines and calculations. "The entrance is angled, like a ship's prow. It splits the force. And these vents?" He traced the faint lines depicting the fissures. "They let the pressure out. The water can't get a grip." Anya studied the drawing, her brow furrowed in concentration. She wasn't looking at it as a curiosity. She was trying to understand it. "Your father drew this?" "He did." "He was a clever man." She looked around the cavern again, seeing it not as a dark hole, but as a piece of a larger design. "It's going to be a home." It was the first time someone had called it that. The words settled in the cool air between them, solid and real. "Yes," Elias said. "It will be." Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The rhythm of the work became the rhythm of his life. The sun would rise over the eastern headland, and its first light would find him already hauling, cutting, or lifting. The sea was his constant companion, its moods shifting from glassy calm to a restless chop. He learned its sounds, the gentle lapping against the rocks below, the hollow boom as a larger swell entered the cave's mouth, the hiss of spray on stone. Burro, ever present, would lie on a bed of old sacks just inside the entrance, a silent overseer, his head on his paws but his eyes missing nothing. The cabin took shape with a slowness that would have driven a less patient man to despair. He had no help, save for the mechanical advantage of levers and pulleys. Setting the main ridge beam, a colossal piece of fir 40 feet long and weighing nearly 1,000 pounds, was a week-long ordeal. He built 2 sturdy A-frame scaffolds, one at each end of the planned structure, and used a system of ropes and capstans salvaged from a shipwreck to inch the beam upwards, a fraction of an inch at a time. The ropes groaned under the strain, the wood creaked, and every movement was fraught with peril. A slip, a frayed rope, and the beam would crush him. He moved with a deliberate economy of motion, checking every knot, testing every anchor point he drilled into the granite walls. When the beam finally settled into its cradle atop the king posts, he slumped against the cave wall, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Boro came and nudged his hand, whining softly. Elias smiled, a rare and fleeting expression. "We did it, boy." He sheathed the walls with thick, hand-hewn planks, leaving a 4-inch gap between the wood and the cave's rock face. This, according to the journal, was crucial. The air gap would act as insulation, trapping the geothermal warmth that seeped from the deep rock and creating a barrier against the damp chill of the cave itself. He filled the space with dried moss and seaweed he and Boro gathered from the high tide line after storms, a painstaking process of harvesting, drying, and packing that took weeks. The villagers saw him gathering the cast-off sea wrack and shook their heads. "The boy's building a rat's nest," someone muttered at the general store. "It'll stink to high heaven and be rotten by spring." Elias ignored them. He knew the salt in the seaweed would repel pests and resist rot. His father's journal had been clear. The front of the cabin, the wall that faced the sea, was his greatest challenge. It couldn't be a normal wall. It had to be a breakwater, a fortress. He constructed it from the heaviest timbers, interlocking them with complex mortise and tenon joints that he cut with a saw, a chisel, and a mallet. Each joint was a puzzle, requiring hours of precise work. A shaving too thick and it wouldn't fit. A shaving too thin and it would be weak. His hands, already calloused, grew thicker, the skin like leather. He'd often work late into the evening by the light of a single lantern, the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of his mallet a lonely counterpoint to the surge of the tide. He built 2 small, thick-paned windows into this wall, using glass he'd scavenged from the same wreck as the capstans. They were set deep into the timber, angled slightly downwards, and protected by heavy wooden shutters that could be barred from the inside. They were not for the view, they were for the light. Below them, he constructed a door of 3-inch thick oak, reinforced with iron straps he forged himself in a small stone hearth he built at the back of the cave. The hinges were massive, the bolt a solid bar of steel. When that door was closed and barred, it felt as though it had become part of the cliff itself. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose concern was as relentless as her husband's skepticism, would sometimes leave a stew or a loaf of bread at the bottom of the path. She never climbed up. She'd call his name, wait for him to appear at the cave mouth, and then retreat. "You'll catch your death in that damp place, Elias," she'd say, her voice tight with worry. "There's a room at our house. You know that. It's not right for a boy to be alone like this." "I'm not alone," he would say, gesturing back into the darkness where Boro's shape was a solid shadow. "And I'm warm enough." He built a fireplace and chimney at the rear of the cabin, a masterpiece of dry stone masonry. It was the one skill his father had taught him with his hands instead of his words. They had built the hearth in their old cottage together the year before he died. "A good hearth is the heart of a house, son," he had said, his large hands guiding Elias's smaller ones as he set the stones. "It draws the cold out and the people in." Elias remembered the feel of the mortar, the precise fit of one stone against another. He built this new chimney with the same care, venting it through a natural fissure in the cave's ceiling that he painstakingly widened and lined with flat stones. It was a slow, arduous process, working on a ladder in the near darkness, but when he finally lit the first fire, the draw was perfect. Smoke billowed up and out, and a steady, radiant warmth began to fill the wooden interior. Boro, who had watched the entire construction with intense interest, immediately curled up on the stone hearth, sighed, and went to sleep. As autumn deepened, the sky grew grayer, and a new urgency entered Elias's work. The winds grew colder, carrying the first bite of winter. The fishermen, Mr. Gable among them, began pulling their boats further up the shore, securing them with heavy chains. The talk in the village was of the coming winter. The old-timers saw the signs. The geese had flown south weeks early, the squirrels had gathered a frantic abundance of nuts, and the woolly bear caterpillars wore thick black bands. It would be a hard winter, a very hard winter. "You better hope that fire of yours is a big one," Gable said one afternoon, seeing the plume of smoke rising from the cliff face. "Because that's the only warmth you'll have when the spray starts to freeze on your walls. Wait until the ice comes. You'll see." Anya visited again, this time bringing a stack of books. "For the long nights," she said, her smile shy. She stepped inside the cabin for the first time. The air was dry and warm, smelling of wood smoke and curing pine. The floor was smooth and solid under her feet. The small windows let in shafts of muted afternoon light, illuminating the details of the construction. The tight-fitting joints, the smooth, planed surfaces of the table and 2 chairs he had built, the neatly stacked firewood that reached the ceiling along one wall. It wasn't a dark, damp cave. It was a room. A snug, sturdy, peaceful room. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with a quiet awe. "You really did it." He had laid in his supplies methodically. Sacks of flour, beans, and potatoes were stored in a small, dry root cellar he dug into the cave floor at the very back. Barrels of salted fish stood next to them. He had a full cord of firewood stacked inside, and another 3 outside on a high ledge, covered with oilcloth. Everything he needed to survive for months was within the confines of his stone and wood fortress. The first snow fell in late November, a light dusting that melted by noon. But it was a promise. The days grew shorter, the light thinner. The sea turned a leaden gray, and its voice grew deeper, more menacing. Elias spent his days sealing every last crack in the status walls with a mixture of pine pitch and wool. He tested the shutters, the door bar, the chimney flue. He was not just waiting for winter, he was ready for it. He sat by the fire one evening, the wind howling outside, a low moan that vibrated through the rock. Boro was asleep at his feet, his flank rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Elias ran a hand over the status cover of his father's journal. He had done everything it said. He had followed the plans, trusted the knowledge passed down to him. He had built his shelter not against the world, but with it. The skepticism of the village felt distant, unimportant. The warnings were just noise. Here, in the warm, fire-lit heart of the mountain, he felt a profound sense of rightness. This was his home. The storm did not arrive with sudden fury. It began with a strange and unnerving stillness. For 2 days, the wind died completely, and the sea lay flat and oily under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The air grew heavy, thick with a cold that felt different, a deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. The gulls fell silent, abandoning the coast and flying inland in great streaming flocks. The old fishermen watched the sky and the sea with grim faces. Mr. Gable hammered extra boards over his windows. "It's a bad one," he said to his wife, his voice low. "The worst I've seen in my lifetime, I'd wager." His eyes drifted, involuntarily, towards the dark slash of the cave on the north cliff. He said nothing, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. On the 3rd day, the snow began. It wasn't the gentle, drifting flakes of a normal snowfall. It was a fine, hard-driven powder, like sand, arriving on a wind that rose from a whisper to a shriek in the space of an hour. The temperature plummeted. Elias stood for a moment at the mouth of the cave, watching the world disappear. The village, the harbor, the opposite headland, all were erased by a churning horizontal wall of white. The sea was a maelstrom of gray and foam, the waves building with terrifying speed. He felt the immense power of the wind trying to tear the breath from his lungs. Boro whined at his side, pressing close against his leg. Elias laid a hand on the dog's head. "Time to go in," he said. He stepped back inside the cabin and closed the heavy oak door. With a grunt, he slid the massive iron bar into place. The sound of it locking home was a solid, definitive chunk that sealed them off from the world. He moved to the windows and secured the shutters, bolting them from the inside. The last of the gray daylight was extinguished, plunging the cabin into a warm, firelit gloom. The roar of the storm was instantly muted, reduced to a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the very rock around them. It was a sound you felt in your bones as much as you heard with your ears. The wind howled and screamed, but inside, the lantern flame on the table barely flickered. The air was still and warm. Boro, who had been trembling by the door, seemed to relax. He walked to the hearth, circled 3 times, and lay down with a sigh, resting his head on his paws and watching the fire as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. Elias added another log to the flames. He felt no fear. He felt a quiet, profound sense of vindication. Every hour of back-breaking labor, every splinter, every callus, every dismissive word he had endured, it had all led to this moment of safety, of warmth, of peace in the heart of the tempest. The first great wave struck the cliff face an hour later. It was not a sound, it was an event. A cataclysmic impact that sent a shudder through the entire mountain. Elias felt the floor beneath his feet vibrate as if from an earthquake. Dust sifted from the high, dark ceiling of the cave outside the cabin. He instinctively looked at the front wall of his small home, the wall his father's journal had called the prow. The timbers groaned, a deep, woody sound of immense pressure, but they held. He heard the hiss and roar of water sluicing through the cave entrance, but none of it touched his walls. The angled design was working. It was splitting the force, deflecting the tons of water, sending it churning back out to sea. He went to one of the shuttered windows and cracked it open a bare inch. A blast of frigid, salt-laden air shot through the gap. In the swirling chaos, he could see nothing but a nightmare of white spray and black water. The noise was deafening, a continuous, grinding roar that seemed to herald the end of the world. He quickly barred the shutter again. For 2 days and 2 nights the storm raged. Elias and Boro lived in their small, self-contained world. He cooked meals of beans and salted fish, read from the books Anya had brought him, and methodically checked the integrity of his structure. The cabin became an ark, a pocket of life adrift in a sea of chaos. The impacts of the waves continued, some so powerful they sounded like cannon fire against the cliff. The timbers of the front wall would creak and groan in protest, but not one of them splintered. The complex joints he had so painstakingly carved were distributing the load, each piece of wood reinforcing the other. The pressure vents his father had described were doing their job, emitting strange, high-pitched whistles as the compressed air forced its way out through the rock fissures deep in the mountain. Without them, the cave would have become a pneumatic cannon, and his cabin would have been the projectile. He thought of the village. He pictured the small wooden houses huddled near the shore, built to withstand ordinary storms, but not this. He thought of the gables, of Anya and her mother. He hoped they were status. He hoped their roofs were holding, that their walls were standing against the incredible force of the wind. There was nothing he could do for them now but wait. On the morning of the 3rd day, he noticed a change. The relentless, high-pitched scream of the wind had lessened, dropping to a lower, guttural moan. The impacts of the waves were less frequent, less violent. The storm was breaking. He waited another full day, listening as the blizzard slowly exhausted itself. The wind died down, and a profound silence fell, broken only by the crackle of his fire and the steady, heavy drip of melting ice from the cave's mouth. When he finally lifted the status from the door, it was with a status of trepidation. The door swung inward stiffly, blocked by something. He put his shoulder to it and pushed. It gave way with a scraping crunch. The world he saw was not the one he had left. Everything was buried. A drift of snow, solid and packed as ice, had filled the area in front of his cabin, reaching halfway up the door. Beyond it, the mouth of the cave was almost completely sealed by a wall of frozen sea spray, a great glittering curtain of ice that blocked most of the light. The only illumination came from a small gap at the very top, casting the cave in a strange blue-white twilight. He grabbed a shovel and began to dig. Boro squeezed past him, his powerful body wriggling through the snow, and began digging enthusiastically at his side. It took them an hour to clear the door, and another 2 to break a hole through the wall of ice at the cave's entrance, large enough to crawl through. Elias emerged into a world transformed and devastated. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the sun on the snow was blinding. The landscape was a uniform blanket of white, drifts piled 20 feet high against the cliffs. Of the village, he could see almost nothing. A few rooftops poked through the snow like dark, forlorn stones. A single thin plume of smoke rose from one chimney, a fragile signal of life in the overwhelming silence. The harbor was gone, choked with massive chunks of sea ice. The fishing boats, those not dragged to splinters, were buried or overturned. The sheer destructive power of the storm was laid bare in the stark, silent morning. His gaze swept the scene, and a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. The Gables house, the one closest to the water's edge, was simply gone. Only a splintered foundation remained, scoured clean by the waves. Elias strapped on the snowshoes he had made from bent ash and rawhide, a task he'd completed by the fire during the long autumn evenings. He checked the small pack on his back, a flask of hot tea, a slab of bread and salted fish, a coil of rope, and a small medical kit his father had kept. Boro plunged into the deep snow beside him, his powerful chest clearing a path, his tail held high and alert. They made their way down the now unrecognizable path from the cave, heading towards the silence of the village. The destruction was even worse up close. Houses that had stood for a century were crushed, their roofs caved in by the weight of the snow. Others had been torn apart by the wind. The silence was the most unnerving part. There were no voices, no sounds of life. It felt like a graveyard. He went first to the place where the Gables house had been. He found nothing but wreckage and ice. He called their names, his voice sounding small and thin in the vast whiteness. There was no reply. A cold fear, sharper than the winter air, gripped him. He moved on, towards the center of the village, Boro scouting ahead, his nose to the snow. It was the dog who found them. Boro began barking insistently near a massive snowdrift that had piled up against the sheltered side of the ruined general store. He was digging frantically, sending plumes of snow flying. Elias rushed over and saw what the dog had found: the edge of a wooden door, barely visible beneath the surface. He dropped his pack and began to dig with his hands, then with his shovel, working with a desperate energy. He uncovered the door to the store's cellar. It was blocked from the outside by the drift. He could hear a faint, weak sound from within. He put his shoulder to the door and heaved, but it was jammed tight by the pressure of the snow. "Stand back!" he yelled, though he wasn't sure if they could hear. He took his small hand axe from his belt and began to chop at the wood around the hinges. The wood was old and brittle. It splintered and broke apart under his determined blows. Finally, with a great crack, the door gave way. A gust of stale, cold air rushed out. In the gloom of the cellar, huddled together under a pile of burlap sacks, were nearly a dozen people. Mrs. Gable was there, her face pale and streaked with tears, holding a small, shivering child. Anya and her mother were there, their faces drawn and exhausted. And there, leaning against the damp stone wall, his leg wrapped in a blood-soaked rag, was Mr. Gable. His face was a mask of pain and exhaustion, but his eyes, when they met Elias's, held a look of stunned disbelief. "The boy," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's the cave boy." No one spoke as Elias helped them out, one by one, into the blinding sunlight. They were weak from cold and hunger. He passed around his flask of tea, and they drank it gratefully. Anya's mother, a frail woman, began to cry softly. Anya herself just looked at him, her eyes wide. She had a long, shallow cut on her forehead, matted with dried blood. Elias knelt beside Mr. Gable. "Your leg," he said.
"Broke it,"
Gable grunted, wincing as he shifted. "When the first wave took the house, the wall came down on me. We were lucky to make it here." Elias opened his kit. He had clean linen for bandages and a small bottle of carbolic acid for cleaning the wound. He had splints made of smooth, hard maple. He worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning the gash that ran down Gable's shin and immobilizing the broken bone. His hands were steady. He had tended to his own injuries often enough. Mrs. Gable watched, her hands clasped to her mouth, her expression a mixture of awe and shame. "We have to get you somewhere warm," Elias said, looking at the small, shivering group. "The store is ruined. Most of the houses are." There was only one place. The journey to the cave was an arduous procession. Elias practically carried the smallest child, while the others helped Mr. Gable, who leaned heavily on two stout men. They struggled through the deep drifts, following the path Elias and Boro had broken. When they finally reached the base of the cliff and saw the dark mouth of the cave high above, a murmur of apprehension went through the group. It still looked like a dark, forbidding hole. "Up there?" someone asked, their voice full of doubt. "Is it safe?" Mr. Gable, leaning on his makeshift crutches, silenced them with a look. "The boy's still breathing, isn't he said, his voice raspy but firm. "His place is the only one left standing. Now stop your whining and climb." When the last of them had finally entered the cabin, a collective gasp went through the group. They stared, wide-eyed, at the impossible reality of it. The dry, steady warmth from the fire, the smooth wooden walls and floor, the scent of wood smoke and pine, the lantern casting a gentle, golden glow over everything. It was not a cave, it was a sanctuary. Mrs. Gable sank onto one of Elias's benches, her body trembling. "It's warm," she whispered, as if it were a miracle. Elias stoked the fire and put a large kettle of water on to boil. He brought out blankets and distributed his stores of food. Soon, the survivors were huddled around the hearth, sipping hot, sweet tea and eating thick slices of bread. The color began to return to their faces. The children, who had been silent with shock, began to whisper to each other. Life was returning. Later that evening, after everyone had eaten and found a place to rest, Mr. Gable motioned for Elias to come over. The old fisherman was propped up against the wall, his splinted legs stretched out before him. The firelight flickered across his weathered face. "I laughed at you," Gable said, his voice low and heavy with remorse. "I called you a fool. Me, who's lived on this coast my whole life, thinking I knew everything the sea could do." He shook his head slowly. "I was wrong. You weren't building against the water. You were listening to it." He looked around the small, sturdy cabin, at the faces of the people it had saved, his people. That thing your father knew, you brought it to life. This place, this isn't just a cabin, boy. It's wisdom. Wisdom made of wood and stone. He met Elias's gaze, and for the first time the younger man saw not scorn or pity, but a profound and humbling respect. "I'm sorry," Gable said, the words coming out with difficulty. "And thank you. You saved us." Elias simply nodded. He looked at Anya, who was tending to the cut on her mother's hand. She looked up and met his eyes, and in her gaze he saw everything he needed. It was not triumph he felt, but a deep, quiet sense of purpose fulfilled. His father's knowledge had been honored. His work had held. His home had sheltered them. The cave cabin became the heart of the village's recovery. For 2 weeks it was a shelter, a hospital, and a town hall. Elias, once the strange outcast, was now the center of their survival. He shared his food, his warmth, and his knowledge without hesitation. He showed them how to navigate the deep snow and how to find firewood that wasn't soaked through. He led the search parties that looked for the few families who remained missing, his quiet determination a source of strength for everyone. Mr. Gable, his leg healing, became Elias's most vocal advocate. From his seat by the fire, he directed the rebuilding efforts with his old authority. But it was a new kind of authority, one tempered with humility. "Listen to the boy," he would tell the others. "He knows the grain of the world better than any of us." When spring finally came, melting the great mountains of snow and revealing the full extent of the devastation, the villagers did not rebuild their homes in the same places, huddled by the water's edge. They moved them back, higher up the slope. They built with heavier timbers and deeper foundations. They came to Elias, asking for his advice on how to angle a roof against the wind or how to brace a wall for the sea. He never gave long speeches. He would take a piece of charcoal and sketch a design on a scrap of wood, or he would simply show them, his hands demonstrating the proper way to cut a joint or set a stone. His father's journal, once his private inheritance, became a source of public good. Anya would sit with him in the evenings, carefully transcribing the fading script into new, clean notebooks so the knowledge would not be lost. The years passed. The village was reborn, stronger and wiser than before. The story of the great blizzard and the cave boy who saved them became a local legend, a cautionary tale about pride and a testament to unconventional wisdom. Elias's cabin remained, no longer a home for one, but a shelter for all. It was known as the Haven. Fishermen caught in sudden squalls knew they could find safety there. In the winter, it was kept stocked with wood and dry goods, a permanent outpost of security against the unpredictable sea. Elias and Anya married. They built a new house for themselves, high on the ridge, using the same principles of strength and harmony with the landscape that he had learned in the cave. But they often returned to the Haven, spending quiet evenings by the stone hearth, the place where their lives had truly begun. Boro grew old, his muzzle turning gray, his movements slow and deliberate. He still followed Elias everywhere, his patient, intelligent eyes as watchful as ever. One warm summer afternoon, 15 years after the great blizzard, Boro did not get up to greet him. He was lying in his favorite spot on the hearth in the Haven, his head on his paws, as if he were only sleeping. His great, loyal heart had simply stopped. Elias knelt beside him, stroking the soft fur on his head for a long time. There were no tears, only a profound sense of loss for the silent companion who had been with him through it all, the one who had never doubted. He buried him on the cliff top, overlooking the sea, and carved a simple stone marker. Boro, a good dog, he knew. Elias himself grew into a quiet, respected elder. His hands, gnarled with age and work, were a map of his life. He taught the village children how to read the weather in the clouds and the tides, how to tie knots that would never slip, and how to build things that would last. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. He and Anya had 2 children, a son and a daughter, who grew up with the roar of the sea and the scent of wood smoke in their blood. He taught his son how to shape wood and stone, passing on the knowledge from his father's journal just as it had been passed to him. Decades flowed by like the tide. Anya passed away one winter, as peacefully as Boro had, in her sleep. Elias lived on for a few more years, a fixture in the village he had saved, a living link to its past. He spent more and more of his time at the haven, sitting by the fire, the memories of his life held within its sturdy walls. He died in his 87th year, on a calm autumn day when the sea was as flat and gray as slate. The entire village and people from settlements all along the coast came to pay their respects. They buried him on the cliff top, next to Boro, in a simple wooden coffin his son had built. They placed a granite stone over his grave, larger than the one for his dog. Mr. Gable's grandson, now a master shipwright, carved the epitaph. It did not list dates or accomplishments. It said only, Elias. He built with the world, not against it. His work held. Long after the last person who remembered his face was gone, his legacy endured. The haven stood, a permanent feature of the cliff face, the wood of its walls petrified by the salt air, the stone of its hearth blackened by a century of fires. It became a landmark for sailors navigating the treacherous coastline. Stories were still told of the great blizzard and the quiet, stubborn boy who listened to his father's wisdom. Young couples would sometimes walk up to the cave on summer evenings and look out at the sea, feeling the profound sense of peace and strength that lingered in the air. The structure stood as a monument, not to one man, but to an idea, that with patience, with knowledge, and with the courage to see the world differently, a single person could build a shelter strong enough to hold back the storm, and in doing so, save everyone.